Union, South Carolina. They call it the City of Hospitality. A typical small town where neighbors know one another and life revolves around family and religion. Downtown, only 5 blocks long, is quiet on Sundays, except for the occasional passing train and the ringing of church bells. The nearby textile mills provide steady work for many Union residents. And 60 miles of highway and winding back roads isolate the town from the dangers of the nearest big city, Columbia. Around 3:30 p.m. on October 25th, 1994, Susan Vaughn Smith left the Conzo Products Company, a fabric, trim, and tassel manufacturer, where she worked as a secretary. She was upset. Her boyfriend, Tom Findlay, the son of the company owner, had recently ended their relationship. At the time, Susan was separated from her husband, David, and had been dating Findlay for a few months. The late afternoon air was beginning to chill as the 23-year-old Smith arrived at the daycare center to pick up her 2 young children, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. Unable to get thoughts of her boyfriend out of her head, she stopped at a tavern on her way home, where she sat in the parking lot, talking to a friend from work. She then returned to the office with her kids, hoping to patch things up with Tom. Her efforts failed. At around 6 p.m., Smith finally arrived at her small house on the northern edge of town. After making the boys a dinner of pizza, Susan called her friend at the tavern to see if Tom Findlay was there, and if he had mentioned her name. He was, but he had not. Between 7:30 and 8 p.m., Smith strapped her 2 sons into their car seats in the back of her 1990 Mazda Protege. She would later say she thought a drive through the countryside might help clear her head. That she stopped at Walmart to do some shopping, and then got back into the car, intending to drive to a friend's house, but she never made it there. According to the story Smith would later tell, she was stopped at a traffic light behind the Monarch Mill textile plant, 2 miles from quiet Main Street, where a black man broke into her car with a gun in hand. "Drive or I'll kill you," Susan would later report the man as saying. Panicked, Smith said she did as she was told. They drove east on Highway 49, she said, away from downtown Union, the gun pressed against her ribs, the boys crying in the back seat. After about 10 minutes, they reached the access road to John D. Long Lake. Susan said the man abruptly told her to stop the car and get out, then stuck the gun to her side. Smith said she pleaded frantically for her children, but the black man pushed her out of the car and drove off with Michael and Alex. She ran to the nearest house, sobbing and crying for help. The family called 911.
Get to figure out which way he's going.
What kind of car is it? We need to know something.
We're trying to ask her now. A Mazda Protege. What color was it? A burgundy Mazda Protege.
Get them going, Pam. I got 2 kids.
Okay.
That's a black guy, she said.
Black male.
Yes, ma'am.
You know which way?
Do you know which way he went?
She did it. Ask her if she know which way he went. Towards.
Did he have a gun? Ask him, did he have
Okay. Wait till he comes back.
He's trying to get her out of her now.
Did he have any weapons, gun, anything?
Did he have a... Look, going towards Chester. Did he have a gun or a weapon, anything? Did he have a gun? Yeah. He's got a gun.
Got a gun.
Yes, ma'am. Hello?
Okay. We're getting them on the way.
Okay. Do we
Give me
need
your
to tell
name.
you anything? Rick McLeod's my name. Do you need us to tell you anything from our yard or anything?
Okay, can you get a tag number out of her?
Daddy, see if you can get a tag.
Is that on the house number?
105, go ahead.
Said it was a black male driving a burgundy Protege.
Affirmative, 105.
He had 2 juveniles with him.
105, from what I understand, understood these were small children. These are her children, and she jumped out of the car, and he took the car with the children, and he's headed toward Chester. 100, go ahead.
Are the victim and the suspect in this call the same family?
100, from what I gathered by the call, they are not. This is a stranger that had jumped in the lady's car at a red light, and she jumped out.
Simple.
Within minutes, Union Sheriff Howard Wells was on the scene. He immediately notified the FBI and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, a highly trained state police investigating unit. They dispatched agents to Union to assist the sheriff in the search for the alleged carjacker. Soon after, the boy's father, David Smith, rushed to Susan's side.
When I got there, she was hysterical. I had to literally pick her up off the floor and take her into the other room and sit down with her on the couch.
Later that night, David called his father.
I said, she ain't holding a bumper. I would have, they wouldn't have drove off of my kids. I was something when that car would have still been in my hand and he drove off, But there was never any doubt, in his mind that the kids were kidnapped.
I believed Susan. As I've stated before, 100%, completely. Never beyond that I didn't believe her beyond a shadow of a doubt. Never.
David, like most people in Union, believed Susan Smith's story. By the next morning, word of the kidnapping had spread rapidly. Many residents would dedicate countless hours to a 9-day search for Michael and Alex Smith. A search that would end not in the safe return of the boys, but in the exposure of a lie that would shock the nation.
Then please let me take them. And he said no, he didn't have time because they were in car seats and it was going to take time for me to get them out of the car seat. And they just told me, he said, but I won't hurt them. And he just took off. But he had a gun, and my big thing is they were screaming, hollering, crying, and I'm just scared that he just lost his patience or something.
I plead to the guy, to the man, me and my wife plead to him to please return our children to us safely and unharmed. We love our children very much, and we want them returned to us safe and sound.
Pray even now for their safe return.
Thank you.
Was last seen wearing a red and white striped outfit and a blue and red coat.
In an investigation where the suspect is unknown, where you don't know where he's liable to turn up, there's not a lot more than you can do is take the complaints, follow up on them, develop your leads, develop your suspects, and rule them out one at a time. It's slow moving. I have to apologize. There's nothing more that can be done for that. But like I say, it's a classic investigation that could not be run any different anywhere else.
Before long, Susan appeared with her husband David to make a tearful plea for the return of their children.
I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't do anything but think about them. And I just want to hug them so bad and tell them I love them.
From the moment Susan Smith reported her children missing, a nationwide search began for her car. In South Carolina, officials led by State Police Chief Robert Stewart began a parallel investigation, as is commonplace in cases of child abduction. They questioned both Susan and David Smith, while following up on other leads about the supposed black carjacker. One of the problems complicating the search was that the description Susan Smith had provided for the composite drawing of the carjacker was so generic, it raised suspicion.
Of course, it had to be acted on because you have children's lives at stake. But over a period of a couple of days, we had some real concerns with that and with the concerns if it was false that it would cause in the community. And we tried to be very careful how we acted on that in conducting interviews of subjects based on her description.
A reporter with WIS-TV in Columbia, South Carolina, Heather Hoops, drove to Union to cover the story.
Discussion started right away about that composite and how big it was and how it described half the people in Columbia and should we use it and what should be done. And eventually we pulled it off the air.
But the search for the carjacker and the little boys went on. And the residents did their part. They assisted police by printing thousands of missing posters, distributing photos, tying yellow ribbons around mailboxes and telephone poles, and scouting wooded areas on horseback. Local and national media descended on Union and beamed the story around the world.
I would do live shots for stations around the country, and they were asking the question, well, hey, did they think the mom did it? It was a question that was on a lot of people's minds. Susan said things like, I loved them, I really did. Well, that's past tense. I mean, are they dead? Do you know something we don't?
But doubts about Smith's sincerity grew rapidly. On the second day of the search, she took a lie detector test and failed. In an attempt to get a quick confession, police confronted Smith and accused her of being involved in the disappearance of Michael and Alex.
She immediately became belligerent, cursed the agent, and that was the end of it. So we knew she was the kind of person that we would have to very easily work into a confession. You couldn't intimidate her into it.
Nor could the authorities call off the search. Sheriff Wells, the FBI, and police kept on checking the hundreds of leads that came in every day. Susan and David Smith stayed with their families at the home of Susan's mother and stepfather, Linda and Beverly Russell, waiting anxiously for news.
It was very long days, waiting out at the Russells, watching people come in, watching people go. You're like on a roller coaster, up and down, because there's so much hearsay.
On the third day of the search, there seemed to be a breakthrough. A car matching the description of Susan's Mazda was spotted in North Carolina. But it was not her car. In vain, divers searched the waters of John D. Long Lake from the shoreline to 100 feet out. And the FBI searched Susan's house, but came up with nothing. After almost a week of silence, Susan and David Smith appeared before the television cameras once again.
I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much. And your daddy and his whole families love you so much. And you guys have got to be strong. Because you are, I just know, I just feel in my heart that you're okay. But you got to take care of each other. And your mom and daddy are going to be right here waiting on you when you get home.
As the daily interrogations of Susan proceeded, police discovered inconsistencies in her story. The greeters at Walmart didn't remember seeing her on the night of October 25th. The friend Susan claimed she was going to visit wasn't even home that evening. And there were more.
She said there were no other cars in the intersection, no possible witnesses there, when in fact that light will only turn red for the direction she was traveling if there was cross traffic.
On day 8, Smith changed her written statement when police confronted her with new reasons why her version of the supposed abduction didn't add up.
It was like an elaborate chess match. She'd make a move, we'd make a move, until it finally got resolved.
Susan, yesterday I know authorities searched your house inside, outside, underneath. Were you there at the time, and do you know what they were looking for?
No, ma'am, I was not there, and I do not know. I did agree, sign a form for them to do that. I was aware they were going to do that, and I understand that's just one of the normalities they have to do in any investigation.
Sources close to the investigation, Susan, have told NBC News that federal agents are focusing, in fact, on the relationship between you and Mitchell Sinclair, the man that you were going to visit that night, the man you said you were going to visit with your children, they've told NBC that there were inconsistencies in your stories. Do you know what inconsistencies they were referring to?
No, ma'am, I really do not know that.
We are in Phoenix this morning, but across the country from here, the kidnapping of two little boys, 3-year-old Michael Smith and his 14-month-old brother Alex, has gripped the town of Union, South Carolina. From the beginning, on October 25th, their mother, Susan, has maintained that she was the victim of a carjack, that her sons were caught in the middle. Right now, we want to go to Union to get the story firsthand from Susan Smith and her husband, David. Susan, how are you doing this morning?
Doing okay. Very little sleep last night, but I'm okay.
There was some news yesterday and some promising leads in this case. How are you coping with the disappointment of the news from yesterday?
I was running around my house yesterday morning all excited. I really thought that they had really found something that was, I really thought they had found one of my children, and when I got to the courthouse and found out that the lead had disintegrated or when there was nothing there, I was very devastated, very disappointed. Got my hopes up and was let down, but I haven't given up hope. That was maybe one of many disappointments, but maybe that's going to be right.
David, where do you think your children are?
I have no idea.
Do you hold out hope that they're still alive?
Yes, we both do, very strongly.
This is going to be a little bit difficult to talk about, but even folks in Union wonder about the both of you. They wonder if all of the truth of this story has been told. Susan, what do you say to that?
I say that on my behalf, the truth has been told. I know right here what the truth is. I can see from their side why they have to do the things they have to do. But the Lord and myself both know the truth. I did not have anything to do with the abduction of my children. I don't think any parent can love their children any more than I do, and I'd never even think about ever doing anything that would harm them. And
David.
yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I was just going to say it's very painful to have a finger pointed at you when it's your children involved.
David, this is as equally a difficult question. Are you satisfied that that's true?
But what's true?
That Susan has told everything she knows?
Yes. I believe my wife totally.
Susan, we're led to believe that investigators spent quite a bit of time at your place yesterday. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
And what do you think they were looking for?
I have no idea. I granted them permission to search my house under the impression that was one of the normalities of the investigation. As far as what they were looking for, what they took, I have no knowledge of that.
David, the question that arises in people who have been following this so closely, and certainly you have to know how much emotion that this has generated across the country, is why someone who would be interested in carjacking or stealing a car would want to continue to take a couple of little kids with them. Have you been able to fathom that, or could you think of why someone would want to kidnap a couple of little kids unless there was some ransom or something involved?
No, I have no idea why the suspect why he even took the children and why he has not released them yet. We have no knowledge whatsoever.
Susan, what do you think?
I think it takes a very sick and emotionally unstable person to be able to take two beautiful children like that, to be able to keep them from their parents, to keep them from where they do belong. I can't imagine why anybody would want to do such a thing as what has happened.
David, what message do you have for folks around the country who are watching right now?
That the American people, that this nation, that they don't give up on Michael and Alex, that they continue to search for the vehicle, for the children, or for the suspect himself, and that they keep our family, me and my wife and our family, but especially Michael and Alex, in their prayers, and keep searching until they are found.
David and Susan, we thank you so much for your time this morning.
You're very welcome.
Later that morning, Susan met with police behind a local church at a recreation center. Smith, worn down by day after day of intensive interrogations and relentless media scrutiny, finally broke down. It was in this small windowless room at about 2 p.m. on Thursday, November 3rd, that a tearful Susan Smith begged Sheriff Wells for his gun. She told Wells her children were not all right and fell to the floor sobbing. She said that the car and the children were at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Divers found the car 122 feet from the shore, upside down, under 18 feet of water. Through the murky darkness, the beam of a diver's flashlight illuminated a small hand pressed against the window. As the car was pulled from the water, the bodies of Michael and Alex were visible through the side windows. Back at the church, Susan Smith was allowed to prepare an unusual confession.
They wanted to get something in writing, but they didn't want to get into a situation with a confrontation to the point where they could get nothing in writing. So that's why she was allowed to, at that point, just write out her account of what happened.
In her written confession, Susan Smith claimed that she was suicidal on the evening of October 25th, that she was living in what she called a vale of tears, not wanting her children to live without a mother. Smith said she was planning to kill herself and take her children with her. After driving around Union for over an hour, she pulled into the access road at John D. Long Lake. She let her car roll down the boat ramp, but soon stopped it by pulling up the emergency brake. Later, she got out of the car, released the brake, and let it roll down the ramp into the water.
Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months. The vehicle, a 1990 Mazda, driven by Smith, was located late Thursday afternoon in Lake John D. Long near Union. 2 bodies were found in the vehicle's back seat. Identities are pending an autopsy. Charges against Smith will be signed by Union County Sheriff Howard Wells. 16th Circuit Solicitor Thomas Pope said Thursday a bond hearing will be held at 10 a.m. at the Moss Justice Center in York before Circuit Judge Henry Floyd. Smith is incarcerated at an undisclosed location.
Did she confess? Did she tell you where the car was, Sheriff?
I was heartbroken. It was a sickening feeling that I've never experienced in my life before. I felt empty. I felt hollow. I felt betrayed.
Later that night, as the car was removed from the lake, the bodies of her 2 children remained in their car seats, grossly deformed from being underwater for 10 days.
There's a haze over Union, South Carolina today. For many who live here, a haze of bitter disbelief.
I just don't understand.
What April Vincent doesn't understand is how her former high school classmate, 23-year-old Susan Smith, could be accused of killing her own children. Even harder to understand is how Susan Smith stuck to her story for 9 days that a carjacker drove off with her kids, when now authorities say she has confessed to driving her very own children into this lake.
This hurts.
Today, children were clinging to their mothers. Have you explained to him what the story is now and what she's accused of? Some things are better left unsaid.
She needs a psychiatrist. She needs something worse than that. I've never heard anything like this. This is the worst way that Union County could ever be brought on the news. It hurts to know that somebody would do that to a young baby.
Many in the town of Union felt betrayed by Susan Smith, especially members of the African American community, since Smith had chosen to falsely blame a black man.
Better left unsaid. Yeah. But what's being said in the African American community is this.
Blaming on the black man it's the same. I mean, to fabricate a whole picture and everything. Pictures nationwide.
Carl Long says he was questioned by police last week.
They made me feel kind of bad coming picking me up off my job early in the morning.
There is lots of tension.
Racial tension?
Yes.
I'm not really angry. I'm hurt.
The folks in the black community tonight tell me that there will be much healing to be done here, and it's going to take quite a while. Let's listen now to some folks, both black and white, how they feel that this healing will take place here in Union County.
They're always accusing black people of doing things that they do themselves.
Anytime you say black man and white woman, it's all over. You know, I mean, that's my opinion. Anytime you say a black man, that's it. And that's why a lot of us are single now. All of our men are locked up. Some of them are innocent.
She wouldn't have testified that she done it. They still would be looking for this suspect.
What the mother did in any way diminishes the quality, the character, the courage of what they did. And so my thoughts and prayers are with them today. And I would hope the American people would feel that way as well. I think we were all moved and deeply impressed by how that community responded. And this awful turn of events cannot undermine that.
With the arrest of Susan Smith, the town of Union began to mourn as quickly as it had rallied to Susan's side. The yellow ribbons that had been tied to trees and lampposts were replaced with blue and white ones as a remembrance of the boys. The boat ramp at John D. Long Lake was transformed into a shrine for Michael and Alex. Overnight, the love for Susan Smith turned to hatred.
You need to cry! They were ready to lynch her. I think the whole country was. They didn't have any answers for what she did. They couldn't understand how she would do something like this to their family member, and they wanted her hiding.
Because it's a death penalty case, under South Carolina law, we have a number of aggravating circumstances that would allow it to be a death penalty case. But again, it's my policy to not just shoot from the hip until I've seen all the facts. I haven't read all the reports.
With his client, then Mr. Bruck, as I understand it, is waiving the bond hearing at this time. Based on the representations of counsel, then Ms. Smith will remain in the custody of law enforcement and remain in detention until there's further motions brought before this court.
It will be a long time before any of us can even begin to think about overcoming what has happened to us. We have no answers as to what happened. We do not understand why it happened.
David
Smith looked on as his wife Susan Smith entered a courtroom in York County, South Carolina for the first time since she was arrested for the murders of her 2 young sons.
Obviously, he's thinking there's a mental issue. We need to get it before the objective examiner to make a determination of whether or not there's an issue.
State Solicitor Tommy Pope wants Smith evaluated to see if she's competent to stand trial. He called on a psychiatrist to testify about why it's important to make the evaluation quickly. But Smith's attorney says it's premature to be determining Susan's mental state. He fears it could be used against her if the state seeks the death penalty.
She is, at this moment, very fragile. She is regressed. She is not able to protect herself.
They poured in from all corners of South Carolina. Some say they drove for hours to get here, and it took most of them at least an hour just to get inside, where they could pay their respects to this man, the father, standing by the single coffin that bears his 2 sons.
When we hugged the father, he just said, "Thank you for coming." He gave us a huge hug, and you can feel his sadness when he touched you. He's just so sad.
We were not allowed to take you inside, but 4 rooms, we are told, are filled with nothing but flowers from all over the country.
It's something I ain't never seen before. I mean, flowers. They're more than a flower shop.
But this is not the only place in Union attracting crowds. A mother carrying 1 baby in her womb leads another bearing flowers along the same path that carried 2 small boys to their deaths.
It's beyond my imagination what happened here.
They come from all over South Carolina bearing flowers, prayers, and a sense of bewilderment as they stare at a cold, dark lake and imagine the horror.
Those babies floating in that car before they went under. Yes.
These 2 small boys, strapped in the back of their mother's car, as it plunges into the water, floats a little, rolls upside down and descends to the bottom.
We wonder if the babies hollered for their mother, if she heard anything, and how she could live with the fact of knowing those kids were in there alive.
As people continue to flock to this, the very spot where we're told the car went into the water with the 2 little boys in it, we're learning a little more about what might have been going through the accused killer's mind that night, the mother, Susan Smith. Sources are telling 7 News that in her confession, Susan Smith said she came here to commit suicide, that she was totally despondent that night about money, financial problems, about broken relationships. What we don't understand is, if that's true, why the children were the only ones to actually die.
The nation was stunned by the deaths of Michael and Alex Smith. Even more shocking was that the confessed murderer was also their mother. Crime statistics indicate that more than 1,000 children in the U.S. are killed each year by their parents. Susan Smith, having waived her right to a bond hearing, sat in jail as thousands of people streamed into the funeral home for the closed casket visitation of her 2 little boys. On Sunday, November 6, 1994, Michael and Alex were buried, their 2 small bodies placed in the same casket.
It was heart-wrenching. I mean, that was a tough one. I don't think there was a dry eye. It was 7 miles from the church to the funeral, and by the time we got to the burial site, the cars were still coming out of the church. It was the hardest thing I ever had to go through.
On December 12th, Susan was indicted on 2 charges of murder. On January 16th, the Union County Solicitor Tommy Pope, who would prosecute the Smith case, announced his decision to seek the death penalty.
State of South Carolina hereby serves you with notice that the state intends to seek the death penalty in the above case. State versus Susan Smith indicted for murder.
alleged that Susan Smith did in Union County on or about October 25th, 1994, feloniously, willfully, and with malice aforethought, killed one Alexander Tyler Smith by means of drowning, and said victim died as a result thereof. State of South Carolina versus Susan Smith, indicted for murder. As indictment alleged that Susan Smith did in Union County on or about October 25th, 1994. Feloniously, willfully, and with malice aforethought, killed one Michael Daniel Smith by means of drowning, said victim died as a result thereof.
Smith was appointed a public defender named Judy Clark. Susan's mother and stepfather mortgaged their house to hire a second defense attorney with experience in death penalty cases, David Bruck.
The death penalty is, for her, beside the point. She says over and over again that she wishes she could just die so that she wouldn't have to hurt anymore.
Judge William Howard, who would preside over the case, set the ground rules in a number of pretrial hearings. He started by imposing a gag order on everyone involved in the case, ruling that cameras would be banned from the courtroom.
At the same time, the Simpson case was being tried and had started several months earlier, so we had the benefit of seeing what was going on out there. I felt every time I came into the courtroom that the level of anxiety that I saw was greater than I had seen before, and that it was affecting the way people were addressing the issues, the time that was involved.
The media coverage had been so intense, many believed it would be impossible to find a fair and impartial jury in Union. Under the law, defense attorney David Bruck could have requested a change of venue, but he decided that a local jury would most likely work to Smith's favor.
The prosecution's image of her was of a non-human, a Beelzebub-like character, just unimaginable coldness and evil. And I thought it would be easier to sell that to a jury of strangers somewhere across the state than to a jury in Union County, because they would be asked to believe that this diabolical figure had grown up in their midst for 23 years and no one had noticed.
Jury selection began on Monday, July 10th. By Saturday, 9 men and 3 women had been chosen. 4 jurors were black and 8 white. Judge Howard sequestered them in a nearby hotel. He had set the stage for speedy and efficient justice. In comparison to the O.J. Simpson criminal trial, which took 9 months to reach a verdict, the fate of Susan Smith would be known in only 17 days. The trial of Susan Smith began on July 17th, 1995. It might have been a simple one, but the prosecution made what some believe was a major blunder. They decided to try and show why the defendant killed her 2 sons, even though the law did not require that they prove a motive, and they could have won without doing so. Each day the Union courthouse was packed. Many more waited outside for a chance to get inside.
Not much of a mother. Whatever they do to her can't be enough. Anybody that could drown her babies, any mother could drown her babies, they've nothing to her.
Those who did get inside wouldn't hear Susan Smith speak. State psychiatrists had testified that although Smith was competent to stand trial, she was suicidal and might sabotage her own defense. Under South Carolina law, death penalty trials are divided into 2 parts. The first determines guilt or innocence. The second decides the punishment. The guilt phase of the Smith trial was essentially an open and shut case for the prosecution. In a written confession, Smith had admitted she had let her car roll into the lake with her children strapped in the back seat. There was little chance that Susan Smith would be found anything but guilty.
We didn't feel that there was any defense to the murder charge at all. So the best thing and the worst thing were the same thing, as we felt like there was going to be a murder conviction. The fact that within minutes of this crime she was telling a lie about what had happened to her children made it quite clear that she knew that it was wrong to have killed her children, and that, or at least that she would get in trouble for it. and that's the end of any insanity defense.
But the state wasn't taking any chances.
The defendant had extremely capable attorneys. They would test and they would push against our case. And if they met with resistance, they'd say, well, we're not contesting that. But if it was soft, I can guarantee you they would continue to push right through it. And so part of our job that a lot of people never realized was making sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed on each and every step.
They argued that Susan Smith murdered her children in order to win back her wealthy boyfriend, Tom Findlay, who was known throughout Union as the most eligible bachelor, lived in his family's mansion, worked for his father's company, and was Susan Smith's ticket to the good life. Much of the prosecution's case revolved around a letter that Findlay had sent to Smith a week before the murders. In the letter, he outlined the reasons why he was ending their brief relationship. One of them was her children. Findlay wrote, "There are some things about you that aren't suited for me, and yes, I am speaking about your children. I'm sure your kids are good kids, but it really wouldn't matter how good they may be. The fact is, I just don't want children."
When you've got a letter that says, you know, we could be together, but I'm not ready to have kids, I mean, you know, it's pretty clear-cut as I see it.
Under South Carolina law, the prosecution did not need to prove a motive to win a conviction in the murder case. They only had to prove it was premeditated by a mere second. Smith had conceded that in her own confession when she wrote, "I did go part way down the ramp, but I stopped. I went again and stopped. Then I got out of the car. I dropped to the lowest when I allowed my children to go down that ramp into the water without me."
Really, the state was going to get a murder conviction just for showing us she had confessed to capital murder. We knew that the confession was not going to be thrown out. However, the state made the decision to try to prove motive at the guilt phase. We expected them to do it. We thought it was a mistake, but we thought it was a mistake they were going to make, and they did.
A mistake, according to Bruck, because it opened the door for the defense to present its own counter-argument about Smith's motive. That she was not a cold, evil killer, but a loving, immature, and troubled mother who could not cope with life. That the deaths of Michael and Alex were actually a result of Smith's botched attempt to commit suicide. An argument for which there was some evidence in Susan's past, according to the spokesman for the hospital, that evaluated Smith's mental fitness to stand trial.
Susan had been suicidal in high school to the point that she was briefly hospitalized in the psychiatric unit. Her father had committed suicide, and we know that individuals whose parent commit suicide, they're higher risk for suicide. These facts were brought out in the trial. Also, she had depression. It's plausible that she was very depressed that evening. She had been trying to get Tom's attention. He had been turning her off. This was very important to her.
Now that the door had been opened by the state, the defense walked right through it, presenting evidence of depression and alcoholism in Susan's family tree. The impact of her father's suicide when Susan was only 6 years old. And most shocking, the admission of sexual abuse by Susan's stepfather, Beverly Russell, head of Union County's Christian Coalition and chairman of its Republican Party. His abuse had begun when Susan was 15. The most recent incident was 3 months before the drowning of Michael and Alex.
We had the opportunity to show that on the available evidence, suicide was a much more likely motivating factor than a premeditated, cold, deliberate substitution of her children in favor of this remote chance of snaring a rich boyfriend.
So it brought out sort of the good with the bad. It toned it down and made it into a much more complex, emotional case right from the start, instead of allowing the state to portray it in a very stark, evil way and then have the defense try to reconstruct it in a different setting. The defense took control of the case with the state's first witness and never let go of it from that point on.
Because the defense was arguing that Susan's abusive past made her suicidal, but did not make her mentally ill, the prosecution was not allowed to have its own psychiatrists examine her.
That's one thing that makes those abuse defenses extremely difficult, at least under the structure of our law in South Carolina, is the lack of an opportunity for the state. You know, you're basically using the defense of something unusual in the defendant's mind, but then you don't give us a chance to peer into their mind. It's almost like you putting up a witness and getting to get direct examination, but not allowing me to cross-examine them.
The defense psychiatrist did say Susan intended to kill herself and, quote, take her children with her, a point which the prosecutors really jumped on, saying, well, she didn't commit suicide, and you can't suicide a child. Now, it's plausible that someone could decide to commit suicide and take their children with them. This has occurred in other instances. However, her method here of committing, quote, suicide is very unusual. There are so many opportunities to get out. Now, her kids are strapped into the car seats. I mean, whatever's going to happen is going to certainly happen for them unless she rescues them.
The defense psychiatrist conceded something else about Susan Smith that for some members of the jury proved her guilt beyond any doubt.
His testimony led me to believe, yes, she is guilty. He said that she understood right from wrong. The way she made decisions was not rational, but she understood that it was wrong what she did. So she should be held accountable for what she did.
After a week of testimony, it took the jury only 2.5 hours to come back with a verdict. Guilty of 2 counts of murder. A verdict that didn't surprise anyone. But the defense had won a victory as well. It had presented evidence about Smith that might sway the jury against the punishment the prosecution was so eager to achieve. The death penalty. On July 24th, the penalty phase of the Susan Smith trial began, with graphic and emotional testimony from both sides. The prosecution, in its bid for the death penalty, would visually recreate the deaths of Michael and Alex Smith. And the defense, in an effort to keep Susan Smith off death row, would use her friends and family to explore the most painful events of her life. The defense also had another argument against executing Smith.
I think it was clear that life would be a more severe punishment for her because she loved those children. It sounds strange to say, but she did. And the full horror of what she had done weighed on her more heavily than on anybody else. And it was obvious that was going to stay with her for the rest of her life. The longer her life, the more she was going to hurt. And so the idea of the death penalty as retribution didn't really ring true for Susan.
But the prosecution was about to present a very compelling piece of evidence, hoping to sway the jury in its favor. In the months before the trial, Tommy Pope had prepared a video showing what would happen if a car like Susan's was allowed to roll down the boat ramp and sink in John D. Long Lake. The recreation was videotaped from the shore, while another camera was mounted in the car, roughly where Michael and Alex were sitting.
You got in your mind, well, it'll occur this way, or a car will drop like a rock, or it'll float forever, all the different things. And ultimately, the byproduct of the test, in addition to telling us some things about flotation characteristics, it gave us an internal view of how that car filled up with water. It basically gave us a view of what Michael and Alex would have been facing as the means of their death.
The defense objected to the video and requested that Judge Howard not let the jury see it. They claimed that the daylights and the divers floating in the water next to the car gave a false sense of rescue that Susan Smith, alone in the dark, would not have had. But the judge allowed it.
In the overall sense, what you're evaluating is relevance, whether or not something is relevant. When I looked at it, what was apparent was that within the car, the water coming up was much more slowly rising than it appeared from the exterior of the vehicle. Again, relevant now on the issue of just what could have been done to save the children and how long was the time frame in which something could have been done. And so it was at that point that I thought it really was relevant in that sentencing setting.
The jury sat and watched as it took the water almost 6 minutes to reach the level of the car's interior camera.
That was kind of emotional for me. I didn't realize it would take a car that long to sink. It was like 5 minutes, 52 seconds, something like that. And they took all the sound away. What made it even more eerie, they took all the sound away in the courtroom. You just sitting there watching that car float out in the water. It was really emotional.
David and I watched the reenactment. It was not shown to the court. We could sit and we watched it in the reflection of the windows because the blinds are drawn behind the jury, and we could sit there and watch it. It was very hard. It was heart-wrenching to watch that car just bob, and the front drop down and watch the car, because we just knew, you could visualize Michael and Alex sitting there upside down, strapped in, nothing they could do.
Perhaps equally hard to watch was the testimony of the boy's father, David Smith, who described the monumental loss he had suffered when his children were murdered by his estranged wife.
Basically what we did was bring Michael and Alex back to life through David's testimony, with him telling about taking to the park and all the things that he'd done, and then having him relive their death. That's the first time in my career I'd ever broken down after testimony, and I talked to him and basically apologized to him for doing what we just had to do.
David's testimony had the courtroom in tears. Even Susan Smith, who throughout the trial had avoided all contact with her husband, whispered her apologies as she left.
She walked by and said, "I'm sorry." David just said it just infuriated him inside. He was emotionally drained at that point, but it just infuriated him. She isn't sorry. I don't think she's sorry to this day.
The defense, hoping to counter the prosecution's emotional testimony, called friends, family, and social workers to testify on Susan's behalf. Her stepfather, Beverly Russell, took the stand, assuming responsibility for his sexual abuse of Smith and taking part of the blame for her actions.
The victim impact, so-called, ended up being much more in Susan's favor, because while David testified about his love for the children, so did everybody on Susan's side who were testifying for her. And it became clear that a death sentence was only going to increase the misery of the people who loved Michael and Alex Smith.
The jury agreed. On July 28th, after only 2.5 hours of deliberation, they unanimously voted to sentence Susan Smith to life in prison.
It was either death or life or innocent. So she obviously was not innocent. And I'd already made my mind up that based on the whole case, the death penalty wasn't warranted. So that was the only choice left. I couldn't think it was all her fault. I mean, it was, when it come right down to it, she was the one that she the one that committed murder. But several things leading up to that she could have been helped before all this came about. The people that were closest to her probably could have helped her before then if they had chosen to, but they didn't. And so she was left to keep going in the wrong direction with no help.
Susan Smith was remanded to the Women's Correctional Center in Columbia, South Carolina. Under state law, she is eligible for parole after serving 30 years. For the defense team, it was a victory that spared Susan Smith's life. For the father of the victims, nothing short of death would have been justice.
Well, first of all, me and my family, of course, are disappointed that the death penalty wasn't the verdict, but the jury, again, we respect that they took the testimony among themselves and they came back with the verdict of life, and so they returned the verdict they thought was justice. Of course, like I said, we are disappointed, but it wasn't our choice on what penalty she was to receive.
American justice had rendered its verdict, but it's not the business of the law to answer the far tougher question of why a mother would murder her own children.
I can't say that any theory of why this horrible thing happened makes sense, because murdering children like that love not make sense. And we were really left just looking at what explanation was, made more sense than any other, or was less crazy than any other. Her confession said that she was trying to kill herself and to take the children with her in her disordered thinking, so they'd be in heaven and be happy, would leave this veil of tears. And that's the way people who are acutely depressed sometimes think in a suicidal moment.
She made a conscious decision to stop, to get out, and to still make the car go on in the lake with two kids in the back. You know what I mean? It wasn't these random, I somehow saved myself. You can armchair quarterback it to death now, but I really think that, again, I give the defense credit, but I don't buy it.
She deliberately, premeditatedly murdered Michael and Alex, slammed the door on them, and let them roll. And I feel today, even to this day, that justice was not done. The jury, they knew they were going to have to spend that time and have to run into Linda Russell, run into Sleddy, and put her on death row. They were a county of cowards. There was no justice done in Union County for Michael and Alex.
Susan Smith has spent more than half her life in prison for the 1994 murder of her two young sons, and records obtained by People show that her incarceration has been marred with disciplinary infractions for self-mutilation and drug use. Smith, who turns 46 on Tuesday, became South Carolina's most infamous inmate more than 2 decades ago. In October 1994, she told police that she had been carjacked by a man who had taken off with her two young sons still in her car. For 9 days, she made tearful pleas for their safe return. But it was all a lie. As her story began to unravel, Smith admitted that there was no carjacker. Smith had blamed the crime on a non-existent black man, which led to outrage among the black community. Smith finally told police that she had let her car roll into a lake with Michael, 3, and Alex, 14 months, still strapped in their car seats. Her alleged motive: she was secretly dating a man who didn't want children. The story became international news, even landing on the cover of People. Smith was convicted of 2 counts of murder, and is serving a life sentence in Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood. SC People has pulled her jailhouse records and found that her incarceration hasn't been easy. This summer, she began working in the prison as a landscape laborer, a step down from a position she previously had as a senior groundskeeper. In the past 7 years, she has been disciplined at least 5 times for various infractions, including self-mutilation and the use and possession of narcotics or marijuana. Each infraction has resulted in the loss of privileges, including loss of visitation, canteen and telephone privileges. twice in 2010 and once in 2015. She was disciplined on drug charges, losing privileges for more than a year. In 2000, Smith, then 28, was disciplined for having sex 4 times with 50-year-old prison guard Houston Cagle. He pleaded guilty and spent 3 months in jail. The following year, a prison captain, Alfred Rowe, also pleaded guilty to having sex with Smith and was sentenced to 5 years probation. But Smith claims she has been misunderstood. In 2015, Smith wrote a letter defending herself to the State, a local newspaper. Mr. Cahill, I am not the monster society thinks I am, she wrote to reporter Harrison Cahill. I am far from it. Something went very wrong that night. I was not myself, she wrote. I was a good mother, and I loved my boys. There was no motive as it was not even a planned event. I was not in my right mind. But Smith's ex-husband, and the father of the boys, told People in 2010 that he has never fully recovered from the pain. There's always this nagging, annoying heartache, David Smith said. It's there every day, even if I'm not always conscious of it. According to the jail, Smith is not permitted to give interviews. A call to her former attorney has not been returned. This article originally appeared on People.com.
So this was a headline that gripped the nation, broke our hearts, just broke our hearts. The South Carolina mother who did the unthinkable.
It was a horrifying story that started with a seemingly heartfelt plea.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home.
But it wasn't long before the nation learned the truth about Susan Smith.
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged in connection with the deaths of her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months.
Her confession was shocking. Susan admitted to pushing her car into a lake with her 2 babies strapped inside. Susan was sentenced to life in prison. Her estranged husband, David, to a life of heartache.
I love you boys. Every piece of heart that I have.
I spoke to David after the 5th anniversary of Michael and Alex's death. It was an emotional interview.
So, when you go to visit their grave, which I hear you do that often, you say what to them that you want to share?
Sometimes I just go to talk to them about maybe a problem that I'm having or something that's bothering me. And then sometimes I just go because I want to say, I miss you.
Ooh, that's hard. Okay. I was trying to get through this, really.
Me too.
A few years later, David told us he'd been given a second chance at fatherhood.
I wasn't expecting to be a father again, but I think God knew that I had so much love to give another child. When she was born, I took her in my arms. I was crying. I looked at her and I said, Savannah, I promise you, right here, right now, that I won't be afraid to love you because what happened to Michael and Alex.
Wow. Well, it's been almost 15 years, y'all. Can you believe it's been that long since Susan Smith drowned her 2 little boys in Union, South Carolina? Today, Michael would be 17 years old and Alex would be 15. David Smith is joining us from South Carolina. David, how you doing?
Doing very well these days, thank you.
I'm glad to hear you're doing well. It's still so sad to see that. I know you live with it in your heart every day, and so for us just to be able to look at the video and to, relive that pain, it is pretty devastating. But you moved on. You were able to move forward with your life.
Yes, it's been a very long road, though. I mean, it's been very tough. some severe depression,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of suicidal thoughts, but I'm still here. I'm still making it every day.
Still making it every day. Have you spoken to Susan Smith over these years?
No, I haven't.
Never have not?
No.
Do you want to speak to her, David?
Sometimes I do. I mean, part of me wants to, maybe ask Susan or just tell her what she's done to me, how much pain and suffering that she's put me through. And part of me wants to just ask her again why she did it, but I don't think, to me, that would only give her satisfaction of that maybe she still crosses my mind, and I don't want to give her that satisfaction.
Yeah.
But I do want her to know that, you almost killed me, but look who's still standing.
Wow.
Look who's still here.
Good for you. Let's talk about your being a father again. Savannah's how old now?
Savannah's 8, and I have a son, Nicholas, who is 6.
Who is 6 years old. And was having a boy hard?
It was a little bit of a emotional, trial to deal with, but it didn't take long.
Didn't take long. Does it remind you of the other boys, Alex and Michael?
Yes. Savannah, she's real soft-hearted, real tender-hearted. She gets her feelings hurt very easily, same as Michael. Whereas Nicholas, he's very rambunctious. He's very active. You scold Nicholas and he just looks at you, and he's a lot like Alex. Alex was that same way too.
Wow. And so when you were here the last time, you were talking about how when Savannah was born, you looked in her eyes and promised her you wouldn't be afraid to love because of what had happened to you. Have you been able to keep that promise?
Oh, absolutely. I'm probably more protective than maybe most parents are of their children. And I try not to be, but I'm sure I am. But it's, I don't want to take for granted any time I can spend with them now, because I know how quickly that can change.
Yeah. So, but would you say you parent differently now because of what happened?
I do more stuff like getting on the floor and playing with them, or going outside and playing with them than maybe I did with Michael and Alex.
Do Nicholas and Savannah know about Michael and Alex?
They know some. I mean, they know that, there were 2 little boys that, their daddy loved, and that they were children of mine. And they know that they're in heaven. And, through the years, each one has asked different questions about, Michael and Alex, and I always give them just enough at that time to satisfy the questions that they're asking. I don't go into more details than I have to.
Mm-hmm. But at some point you will tell them the whole story?
Yes, as they get older, I'm sure I'll have to eventually tell them the whole story. And I don't know how I'll do that yet, but I'll figure it out.
Yeah. Do you still visit the graves of Michael and Alex still?
Oh, yes, I go quite regularly. Maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. Sometimes it'll be, 1 o'clock in the afternoon over, or I have found myself out there at 3 o'clock in the morning in the rain. It's just whenever it hits me, that's when I go.
Well, when I just said that Michael would be 17 and Alex would be 15, the audience sort of gasped because everybody's realizing how old they're getting. And I wonder, do you think of them as teenage boys when you visit their graves? Do you think of them as teenage boys, or do you still think of them as the little boys they were whom you last hugged?
Sometimes I try to picture them at different ages through the years of what they would be doing, but most of the time it always just comes back to 3 and 14 months old. That's the way I remember them. That's the way I always see them in my mind.
Well, I wish you the very best with your new family. Thank you so much, David. I'm glad you're continuing to move forward in your life, and that, if Susan Smith is watching, she sees you're still here. Very much so. Thank you so much. We'll be right back.